The agenda this week looked at the role of women in religion, asked if hockey has become an elite sport, and caught up with both the current and the former leaders of the Ontario PC Party. We begin the agenda's week in review with what Canada can learn from Brussels about the problem of homegrown terrorism. I guess there are two options here. Either we figure out how to de-radicalize the people who have been radicalized and now see themselves as having a piece of this fight, or we kill them. And, that's not a great option. So what do we do?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think what's happening here is we're starting to see an expertise develop. And, I don't know how far along it is yet. No one really knows where it's going. But there is definitely, because of the high concentration of this problem in Belgium, there are groups of people who are starting to figure out what do you do in this situation, and what do you say to someone who's early on in the process of radicalization, and what do you say to someone who's much further along? It's growing, and I think the idea of it being a reactionary or proactive approach is an important distinction. So for the intervention, once someone's already been radicalized, there are now people in municipal governments in Belgium that are essentially building a collection of services that can kind of wrap around a young person and help them change their lives. Very similar to what you might see in North American cities when it comes to former gang members who need an entirely new social network in order to really change the direction they've been going in. But on the proactive side, what I think people are realizing is you cannot alienate the people who are closest to the ground. And what's happened here is youth workers and social workers and educators and people who are working with youth every day here have not had positive relationships with government officials, with law enforcement, with people who need to know how to reach youngsters. And that's slowly starting to change. And that's ultimately what brought me here in the first place, was to see what role can community groups play in this. And I think their role is starting to become more and more respected. The US government and the State Department recently brought a delegation to Belgium of civil society leaders to build those relationships with people in Belgium. And it's something that I think Canada should be doing and would be incredibly effective at, because I think those are the relationships that are going to be really key to helping solve this problem. And it's not a one size fits all solution. Certainly no one knows the answer, but I think engaging with people on the ground who are on the front lines working with youth is a really key part of this.
Okay, pick up on that, Phil. Community groups, who else is responsible for making this happen?
Well, as Jamil said, we have some great experiences here in Canada with programs that we've developed, so I think we can share with our European counterparts. But I do want to make a distinction here. Maybe the best we can hope for is not de-radicalization, but disengagement.
Meaning what?
De-radicalization is when you eject an ideology. You've changed your mindset. Hard to measure. Right? It's not overt. Disengagement is when you change your behavior. You can monitor changes in behavior. As Jamil says, you stop hanging around the wrong crowd. You stop going to certain venues where radicalization is taking place. I was talking to a Belgian researcher just last week, actually. He was in Canada when the attacks took place. And he's working on a project in the Netherlands which aims at disengagement. And he says, I'm not sure I can de-radicalize you. I can help you disengage. Maybe that's where we have to go.
But when you disengage, though, what's left?
Well, unfortunately, you may in fact still have the vestiges of the ideology, which means that in the worst case scenario, in the perfect storm of circumstances, if you will, you can re-engage. But again, I'm not saying de-radicalization is impossible.
Sounds like a bridge too far.
Well, as an ex-intelligence guy, I can't hang my hat on that. So you're telling me that you've de-radicalized, so therefore Steve Paikin is no longer somebody of concern to me because you've ejected what you believed in before?
Yeah.
I can't tell that.
You can't go there.
I can't.
Jamil, give us a sense of, you're having spent several weeks there right now. What do you think is at stake for Belgium going forward?
Well, I think a big part of what's happening here that often goes unsaid is that the future of cities in this country, the future of cities in Europe, the future of cities in North America are diverse, and they and to be more specific, in Belgium, over 50% of the kids in some of the biggest cities in this country are actually from Muslim backgrounds or from immigrant backgrounds. And so this is not just a matter of how do we deal with this problem now, but it's how do we make sure that the growing percentage of young people who are in the middle of these politics feel like they are connected to Belgium and want to be part of this country and contribute to this country and this economy. And more than making them feel that way, I think it's making this country open to their participation. So I look at this as a fight for the future. This is about does the West have a future in the people who are going to be populating our cities? Or do we continue to walk on this path where I think, and this is where, despite Canada's good policies, we are part of this struggle in the sense that we don't want to look across the Atlantic and see a Europe that's fractured, because those are our allies. That's who we do business with. That's where we have our political history. So I think that that's something we all have a stake in, and Belgium is kind of the spotlight right now, but it's certainly, I think, a problem that all of Europe is thinking about and will continue to think about more and more.
Phil, in terms of Canada, if we don't figure this out, what are the stakes for us?
Not as dire as Belgium. I would argue that given what's happening in Western Europe, I can't imagine a scenario under which we get like that. So I'm very optimistic in that frame. It has to do with our immigration policies, our different societies. We've done a good job. We're not sure maybe why we've done it, but it's worked, so let's keep doing it. I'm very, very optimistic about the Trudeau government's announcement of money for counter-radicalization and citizen engagement. That's a fantastic program. I think it's $15 million over 3 or 5 years. The former government wasn't as keen to do this kind of thing, so I'm waiting to see how that's going to roll out. But I think we've made a really good start on this road, and my challenge is let's keep it going. Let's keep doing what we're doing.
Jamil, let's finish up on this. What do you expect when you get home to have taken away from your time in Belgium?
I think myself and like a lot of other Canadians, I think we often take for granted that we can be very, very critical of our country and that we don't have to necessarily fight for the status quo. But being here, it kind of feels like sometimes the status quo is actually on the line. And I think that there are implications that has for us too. So we can say, yes, we have imperfections as a country, but even the progress we've made so far can be lost if we're not mindful of it.
In the past election, the niqab and the hijab were there were very decisive elements that were used during the election. As somebody who wears a hijab, are you oppressed?
Yes. No. I am not oppressed, if it's as simple as that. I mean, of course, I'm not oppressed by my hijab, so to speak. You know, I think generally there's a lot of things that are challenging of being a woman, that's irrespective outside of the domain of religion. But my hijab, this piece of cloth that I wear, is not really oppressive by any means, and it is foremost grounded for me in choice. And I know that's not offered to all women. Many women are not, who do not choose to wear it out of choice. Many, a few are forced to and are required to do it from, whatever factors. But I think for a lot of women, and I know a lot of women, and I even personally started wearing it kind of as a political statement to show in the post 9/11 world, that we're here, we're kind of normal, it's all good, don't be afraid. But I actually think that this focus on the hijab as a political expression or as a political issue or constantly coming up in political discourse takes away actually from the fundamental value of wearing it, which is for me spiritual. And so kind of in my latter years, I've been trying to really explore that. Why do I wear it? And I wear it foremost because of how I understand my relationship to God. But this constant fixation on it really impacts my ability to hone in and truly understand that spiritual connection, because I'm so often forced to articulate it in political ways, which I think actually is stifling. So it's more so the discourse around the hijab, the discourse around veiling, the discourse around Muslim women that is probably more oppressive than actually being a Muslim woman who veils.
I wanted to ask one of the other women, maybe Brenda, why are we so fixated on the hijab?
Well, I place it squarely on who has the power of the gaze. And this is, in our daily lives or in media representations or what have you. I think that throughout culture and throughout history, there's a fascination with the female body, particularly from heterosexual men who may have that power to direct the lens in particular ways. So I guess I would kind of counter that question with, why are we so fascinated with women in bikinis in the West, right? It has to do with control of female body, and in the colonialist times in the 1900s, when filming was capturing the fascination in the West, Muslim women were depicted as the harem, the free sexual lifestyle, the dance of the seven veils, and there was a titillation factor about how they didn't dress very much compared to the European woman with the corset and showing the ankle with something titillating here in the West. And now, 2016, we're worried that Muslim women are being covered too much, that again, we're concerned about the other. So I guess I talk about in my classes projection of our own discomfort around the female body, around sexuality and what that means. And that can be directed back to how scriptural stories, origin stories play out and create that binary where the masculine is equated with the spiritual, rational, and the female is equated with the material, certainly in the Judeo-Christian and then Islamic, not necessarily originally, but in that tradition as well, equated with the fall or the sin. And so when you have that either or kind of world, we're going to look at women's bodies as temptation, something that keeps us away from the divine. So I think it has to do more with who has the power to name the story.
And Doris, sorry, go ahead, Doris.
I think the historical context is so important to keep in mind. I'm just reminded of Hoda Sharawi in Egypt in the 1920s, who was the head of the Egyptian Feminist Union. And as a political statement, she took off her hijab, making this a sort of public, political, feminist statement. It was in the name of feminist. It was called the Feminist Union. And so it's just very interesting to look at the various timelines, when these things are important, why they're important. Post 9/11, the situation has changed for so many minority groups. It was a Sikh man who was first sort of a victim of murder in post 9/11 because he was mistaken, as a Muslim. I mean, it doesn't matter if he was Muslim or Sikh. The fact was that it was because of his religion. It was because of his outward presentation, his turban, that he was killed. And so I think it's the timeline that needs to be put into perspective. Why are people wearing hijabs? Why are people seemingly to be focusing in some ways more on their religious identities and physical representation thereof in a post 9/11 world? I think that's really fascinating.
Let's share a couple of facts with our audience here. According to a survey by Hockey Canada in the year 2012, 1,300 parents surveyed had an average household income roughly 15% higher than the national median. The majority listed their occupation as, quote, professional, owner, executive, or manager. The Globe and Mail's James Myrtle has described this as a reflection of hockey's new white-collar base. And then, of course, people in this part of the province will remember the longtime Greater Toronto Hockey League president, John Gardner, who once said, "The game has changed in this respect. It used to be that you had a right to play. Now it's, can you afford to pay?" Todd, let's get into this. Has hockey, in your view, become too elitist a sport?
Well, it certainly had a history of some of the things we're talking about in terms of just the cost to play. And I remember as a president of minor hockey here in Calgary that we had many issues with families that were call it being nickel and dime to death or $100 to death or cash called, as it was often referred to inside of some of the teams. Although, I'd also give credit to some of the hockey associations that were taking a different perspective on that and trying to help govern that, if you will. And, I think there's some other steps that we can take as the responsible custodians of the game that can help families so that it doesn't become cost prohibitive. Let's face it, the game itself has a very costly infrastructure associated with it. I mean, rinks are costly to operate. All the back end items that are required inside the game in terms of just the equipment. So I don't think families should be forced into situations where they're having to go to a bunch of tournaments or, doing a bunch of social activities inside the game outside of just the cost of the game. And I think we can do things internally, as parents to help govern that.
Some of our friends watching who don't necessarily follow the NHL as closely as maybe some of us do at this table may not have heard of Matt Duchene. Right. But Matt Duchene is a He's a pretty good player for the Colorado Avalanche. He's a star player. His father estimates that over the 13 years that he played minor hockey, his dad spent north of $300,000 getting Matt to where he could get to. Now, in Matt's case, it worked. Matt's making $6 million a year right now, so that family is fine. But it doesn't work out that way for everybody.
Right.
But is $300,000 representative of what parents are paying in some cases if they think they've got a little tiger by the tail?
I don't know. I guess for Matt, and my kids have both played in the Matt Duchesne tournament in Haliburton. They are intense hockey families there, like they are in most of Ontario. I think that those families who are trying to get their kids to the next level, it doesn't surprise me that over the span of his minor hockey career, it doesn't surprise me at all that that would be the amount of money, because there are things that add up. Tournaments, you win one tournament, you move on to the next one. There's 3 extra nights in a hotel room, plus meals, plus travel to get there, and all the
Team
rest of it.
jackets, the best equipment,
Yeah.
composite hockey
Yeah.
sticks.
Yeah, and if you, I asked the question on my Facebook page recently, what do you pay for registration? So across Canada, it ranged from $200 to $3,000 plus your fundraising fees, plus. So it really depends on where you are. And $300,000, I can see, not for everybody, but for those people who are going for the extra camps or the extra ice time and traveling and joining the special teams, the select teams, I think it doesn't surprise me.
Have you done your family budget on how much you spend on your 3 kids per year for hockey?
Well, I have done that. I will say that last year, with both kids, both of my boys making it to the finals in All-Ontario and both winning regional silver stick and going to international, we were in hotels 32 nights for hockey. We're able to share that with another family, so you would bunk up with someone else, but that's an example of the things that happen when you go all the way in playoffs and all the way in international silver stick.
I want to quote the greatest defenseman of all time, who turned 68, incidentally, on the 20th of March. He said, "My mom and dad were perfect minor hockey parents. Their philosophy was, look, go out and play, have fun, let's see what happens. And I wish there were more parents that thought like that when it came to their kids playing hockey. It was never a job for me. That's what these kids have to understand. Just enjoy it. Keep that love and passion for the game." I think that's what sometimes we do, the coaches and the parents. We suck the love and passion from our kids, and I think that's wrong. Todd, I wonder whether you're seeing what Bobby Orr saw.
Listen, those are great words. Those are, I mean, obviously he's a great person as well, and I think that's what parents should be living by. I think there's another issue that's going on here, and that is the marketing machine behind hockey and the business of hockey. And I'm not talking about Hockey Canada here, or I'm not talking about minor hockey associations. I'm talking about business capitalizing on parents. And I mean, I saw it as the minor hockey president, where you had the spring leagues coming into the rinks promising all kinds of things to these kids, and probably one of the first questions is, can your mom and dad afford to continue to put you in hockey? And again, my impression here is that parents need to take on the responsibility. I've been a big advocate of this all the way through my 7 years on the board, plus obviously all the years that my son was in hockey. We, as the adults of this game, need to be the custodians of the game and take the responsibility and start controlling some of these issues. And it's out of control with respect to spending. And I think parents are being intimidated by other parents. They're being embarrassed. They think they have to do these things. And just as Bobby Orr says, you don't. And I think you should get back to basics.
I don't know if you saw the piece in the Toronto Star a couple of weeks ago by Michael Warren, who used to run the post office in Canada, who asked what brand of conservatism, and here's a little excerpt from it. He said, delegates to the recent Ontario Progressive Conservative Convention will be forgiven if they went home wondering what their new leader, Patrick Brown, really believes. Even his staunchest supporters admit Brown is enigmatic. More than that, he's shown a willingness to compromise long-held ideas, if that's what it takes to advance his political career. In the space of a couple of years, he has swung from a strident social conservative to a liberal light leader with unnerving ease. Is Brown simply trying to redefine himself, or is he a political chameleon who's willing to advance almost any policy to gain power?
One of the most interesting things after the convention was, I think Liberals are nervous about my speech. A number of reporters were commenting on social media, on Twitter, that the Liberals were dysfunctional in the sense that they didn't know how to attack me.
Why do you think?
Adrian Morrow, for example, tweeted they've lost their best line of attack on the environment, and instead of welcoming the fact that they had a conservative leader who wanted to talk about the environment, they were immediately critical. You heard similar comments. Michael Warren obviously was a liberal appointment, and I recognize that people who have been friends and appointees of the Liberal government in the past are going to feel threatened by a conservative leader, unafraid to talk about education, healthcare, the environment, about how to make Ontario a destination for an investment. They're threatened right now because they're continuing to see the Liberal Party in a difficult position. After the Manitoba election, Kathleen Wynne will have the lowest approval ratings in Canada. The by-elections we saw in Whitby, Oshawa, and Simcoe North were some of the worst Liberal results we've ever seen. So I expect them to continue to attack me and to say, rather than defend their own policies, to make accusations that are baseless against me. And I know they're saying, how dare Patrick talk about the environment? You know what? I got involved in politics because of the environment. I listened to Brian Mulroney speak about acid rain, and I told my father, who was an NDP at the time, that I wanted to become a progressive conservative. I wanted to go volunteer for the progressive conservatives. So the notion that I can't talk about the environment and the Liberals think it's disingenuous to give a major speech at a convention about the environment, about climate change, what I would have preferred for Kathleen Wynne and Liberals like Michael Warren to say is, rather than to attack, what I would have appreciated is say, I'm glad we're at a point in Ontario where all three parties view climate change as a serious threat, that all three parties want to do something about it. We shouldn't always have to attack your political adversaries.
I appreciate that, but the small C Conservative part of your base, how do I put this? We're not thrilled with the position you took on climate change, and you heard at the convention where we showed that clip of the speech you gave, you heard a few people yell out, "Oh no," when you said that. How worried are you that you're going to lose the small C Conservative base of your party?
There's two approaches to this environmental challenge. There's the Kathleen Wynne approach, which is a $1.9 billion cash grab, and it can be spent on whatever she wants. Frankly, we've already seen items spent on it that have nothing to do with climate change. It is a revenue grab for the government. My approach is that it should be mandated by the Auditor General, that every cent should go back to tax relief, that we want to do good on the environment, but it shouldn't be an excuse for bigger government. That is a conservative approach to fighting climate change. I do believe the small C Conservatives in our party are supportive of that approach. We actually had a caucus discussion on this, and there was a united caucus position that this was the way forward. And anytime that you have the courage to present change and to put forward new positions for a party and new ideas, there's always going to be those that are hesitant towards change. But in my heart of hearts, it's the right thing to do. The climate change is a threat, and I wasn't going to stick my head in the sand, and I feel very comfortable that I took the right position.
Here's how Maclean's magazine referred to it a couple of weeks ago in the headline that says 2008 all over again, ? Brown has conveniently forgotten that former Liberal leader Stéphane Dion campaigned on the exact same idea, a revenue-neutral tax plan called the Green Shift. So have Green parties all over Europe. Conservatives have long said there's no such thing as a, quote, neutral tax. To them, it is the Liberal unicorn. So why would this be any different? Do you think Stéphane Dion was onto something with that Green Shift in 2008?
I think there were some different challenges with the Green Shift in 2008. But the notion that Conservatives haven't been talking about climate change around the world, I think is incorrect. It may be new here in Canada, what we're embarking upon, but you look at David Cameron in the United Kingdom, one of the world leaders in tackling climate change. Frankly, the first cap and trade was Brian Mulroney and Ronald Reagan and how they dealt with acid rain. So I don't think it's inconsistent with the Conservative approach globally, with recognizing this as a serious threat.
You do believe in a price on carbon?
I do. I believe polluters must pay, and I believe that's a responsible approach to the environment.
I can take a step back and look at these things, a couple more gray hairs on the side of my head and 21 years under my belt. And I got to sit down actually with Kathleen Wynne a number of occasions, leader to leader. Highly personable, comes across as very warm and engaging. I think the way she came across in the election campaign was having the right motives in place. Certainly made a lot of promises to people. Now, almost 2 years hence, a lot of those promises cast aside or embraced parts of my plan. But I think it was a sincerity. She's a very driven politician individual, which I respect, having been in this game for a long time.
She's way more competitive than people think she is.
Yeah, it's an interesting combination of when you come across as having the right motives and sincerity and listening with that drive underneath that skin. It's been, look how well she's climbed the ladder. Now she's premier after being reelected and winning her own party's leadership.
What does it do? I don't want to put you on a couch too much here, but I do need to ask this. What does it do to your self-confidence to lose 2 consecutive elections?
Well, you know you're not going to get a third shot at it. Look, I came from a pretty normal family in Fort Erie, Ontario. My folks are retired teachers. I never aspired to think I'd have the chance on that stage, let alone being premier. I got elected, as Woody Allen says, showing up as 90% of success by running in the right riding and a sweep under Mike Harrison and climb the ladder. Just the chance to be there, to put on the stage, to speak from the heart, to put forward a clear plan was tremendously rewarding. Do I wish I'd win? You betcha. And I think it's right for the province. But do I feel like I got a big kick in the teeth or my self-esteem? Quite the opposite. I thought the chance to be on the stage and to perform, I'm damn proud of that.
Okay, but again, I've talked to lots of politicians over the years, and some of them who have been in your shoes say it takes a year or more to recover, because it's not a professional repudiation. It is a personal repudiation. And it takes a year or more to recover from that personal repudiation. Has that been the case with you?
I don't know. Certainly, you do some contemplation afterwards, right? Do you continue on? And what you said, I think, is very fair. A tougher part, too, is when the team moves on from you after you've led the team as a very cohesive unit. So that ain't easy to take either, but it, again, is part of the business. So you think about, do you stay on or do you leave? Most leaders chose to leave. And I said, I'm not going to have this chance again, so I'm going to use the microphone I've been given. Did I retreat a little bit? Yeah, I took some time away, but I was back pretty fast. And I think I found a way to engage in a policy which is motivating to me, but more importantly, I think important to Ontario's future.
How uncomfortable is it for a former leader to sit in a caucus and see another guy there who used to have your job?
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Like, it's not easy having been in the driver's seat and then you go into the back seat. So that's a bit different. But he worked hard. He won that contest. I wasn't part of that contest. It's the way life is.
Most leaders who lose elections move on. It's not unheard of for a leader to stick around. I think Bob Nixon did it. I think Donald MacDonald did it in Ontario history. William Hague in the UK did it. World party leaders lost, stayed. Why did you choose to do that?
I like it. As I said earlier on, just to be one of the privileged few who can be there. You can advance issues. I missed my riding. When you're leader, you make a big sacrifice to be away. Last night I was at the Lincoln Chamber of Commerce Business Awards. I hadn't been to that event for 8-9 years. It's nice. People are happy to see. I'm Tim there as well, not Mr. Hudak or leader or whatever. It's very enjoyable. I got a beautiful place to represent. Truthfully, there's more balance in life too. When you're leader, you don't see the family that much. You sort of kiss your daughter on the forehead as she sleeps and you're gone before she wakes up. I see them a lot more. I can do things with Maitland that sorry about that.
Tim, I'll tell you something. Everybody who knows you says you're a great dad and you love your kids more than anybody. Good for you.
Yeah. So things that I missed with Miller, I can do now with Maitland.
And that's the Agenda's Week in Review. You can see all of those programs in their entirety on our website, tvo.org, on our iTunes channel, and on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.